The air in the conference room at Nova Systems always smelled like cheap carpet cleaner and stale coffee, a combination that had defined the last 12 years of my life. It was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and the Minneapolis skyline outside the double-pane glass was the color of a wet slate shingle. I sat in the corner, far away from the glossy mahogany table where the visionaries sat. My name is Joel Vance. I am 55 years old, and my official title is Principal Systems Architect. To the executives, that title meant I was the guy they called when the servers started melting. To me, it meant I was the custodian of a complex, beautiful machine that I had built with my own hands. 6 years ago, Nova Systems was nothing but a handful of Python scripts, a single database server, and a mountain of debt. I was the one who wrote the core logistics engine. I spent nights sleeping on a cot in the server room, surviving on cold pizza and adrenaline to make sure our data routing could handle more than 10 transactions a second. Now, that same engine processed millions of shipments across 4 continents for 15 major enterprise clients. I did not build it because I had a fancy degree from an Ivy League school. I built it because I was self-taught, because I had spent my youth reading manual pages in my parents' basement, and because I had a stubborn, borderline, pathological need to solve problems that other people said were impossible. But the boardroom did not care about the hours I had spent debugging memory leaks. At the head of the table sat George Higgins, our chief executive officer, a man who had built a career on nodding sagely while other people spoke. Beside him sat his freshly minted son, Julian Higgins. Julian was 32, wore a gray tailored suit that cost more than my first car, and radiated the kind of confidence that only comes from a trust fund and a Harvard Master of Business Administration. Julian had been appointed Senior Vice President of Strategy 3 months ago, and since then, his primary contribution had been introducing terms like brand immersion and back-end synergy to our weekly stand-up meetings. Today was the final alignment meeting for the Orion Logistics contract. It was a $77 million licensing deal, the holy grail that would integrate our routing engine into the largest supply chain network in the country. I had spent 6 months preparing the sandbox environment, containerizing the code, and optimizing the database queries to handle their massive data load. It was my baby. "We are looking at a paradigm shift," Julian announced, pacing around the room like he was auditioning for a tech documentary. He gestured dramatically at a PowerPoint slide filled with colorful charts. "The Orion deal is going to scale our valuation vertically. The market is ready for a real-time, AI-driven logistics platform." I cleared my throat. It was a quiet, dry sound, but in the silent room it sounded like a cracking branch. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice calm, "the presentation deck lists the real-time routing as a fully integrated module. But as of yesterday, we are still waiting on their database team to expose their security endpoints. If we run the demo without that, the handshake will fail." Julian stopped mid-stride. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity, the way a parent looks at a child who does not understand how a telephone works. "Joel," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we are talking about strategic vision here. We are presenting the future. The technical details can be resolved during the post-merger integration. Let us focus on the big picture. The big picture relies on the demo actually loading, Julian," I replied. "If the database freezes during the live walkthrough, there is no deal." George Higgins chimed in, waving a hand dismissively. "Joel, let us not get bogged down in the weeds. Julian has a handle on this. The slides look fantastic." I looked at Brenda Cole, my direct manager. She was tapping her pen against her chin, looking out the window. She knew I was right, but she also knew who signed her paycheck. When she caught my eye, she gave me a tiny, apologetic shrug. That was when Julian delivered the real blow. "Housekeeping," he said, leaning against the edge of the mahogany table. "For the live demo on Friday, we need to present a unified strategic front. I will be taking the lead on the presentation. Joel, you will be in the room for technical support, but I will handle the walkthrough." I stared at him. The room seemed to grow cold. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "I have spent 6 months building this sandbox. I know every query, every route, and every latency spike. You have never even logged into the console optics." "Joel," Julian said, offering a smug smile, "Orion wants to see senior leadership. They want to see strategic vision. A self-taught engineer in a faded flannel shirt does not sell a $77 million contract. Let the professionals handle the stage. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I did not argue. I had learned long ago that when a fool wants to jump off a cliff, the best thing to do is stand back and let gravity do the work. Understood, I said. I closed my notebook with a soft snap, stood up, and walked out. Click, click, click went my shoes on the linoleum. It sounded like a timer counting down. My workspace was located in the basement level of the building, right next to the server racks. It was a windowless room that smelled of ozone and hot copper, but I preferred it to the glass offices upstairs. Down here, there were no power goals or strategic alignment meetings. There was only the hum of the cooling fans and the clean, logical reality of code. I sat in my chair and stared at the terminal. I was not angry. Anger is a hot, temporary emotion that makes people make mistakes. What I felt was cold, analytical, and patient. I pulled up the system repository on my dual monitors. I had spent the last 2 weeks refining the demo database, creating synthetic datasets that perfectly mirrored Orion's actual shipping lanes. I had also built in a fail-safe risk checkpoint. If the system encountered an unauthorized connection or a path mismatch, it would lock the current container and redirect the request to a local staging sandbox. It was a standard safety feature to prevent live data corruption, but there was a catch. The restore checkpoint required the administrator credentials to be initialized properly. In my documentation, which I had sent to Julian 3 days ago, I had written in bold red text, "Do not launch the presentation build without configuring the environment variables. If you do, the database handshake will default to an encrypted loop, and the system will freeze." I knew he would not read it. A Harvard man does not read documentation written by a self-taught coder. The next 3 days were a masterclass in corporate theater. Julian spent hours in the executive suite, practicing his pacing and rehearsing his buzzwords. I could hear his voice booming through the ceiling tiles, talking about scalable architecture and real-time optimization. Meanwhile, Toby Allen, my junior developer, was sweating at his desk. Toby was 24, eager to please, and terrified of Julian. He had been assigned to help Julian prepare the slides. "Joel," Toby whispered, wheeling his chair over to mine. "Julian wants me to change the dashboard colors from dark blue to bright orange. He says blue is too passive. He wants orange to represent energy and innovation. Did he ask about the database configuration?" I asked, not looking away from my screen. Toby shook his head. "No. He just said to make sure the slides looked polished." I nodded. "Then make it orange, Toby. Let him have his energy." Friday morning arrived, and the air in the building was thick with anticipation. The main conference room had been transformed into a temporary broadcast studio. There was a dual monitor setup, an expensive video conferencing camera, and a catering table filled with pastries that no one was eating. At 9:59 in the morning, the screen flickered to life. 5 executives from Orion Logistics appeared on the monitor. They were sitting in a sleek boardroom in Dallas, looking bored and busy. At the center of their table sat Harvey Peterson, their chief technology officer. Harvey was a legend in the industry, a man who had built his reputation on cutting through corporate fluff and demanding hard technical data. "Good morning, everyone," George Higgins began, offering a polished smile to the camera. "We are excited to show you the next generation of supply chain intelligence." I stood in the back corner of the room, my hands folded behind my back. Julian stood at the podium, looking like a man who had already won. "Thank you, George," Julian said, leaning forward. "Today, we are going to walk you through the Novus engine, a revolutionary platform that utilizes real-time optimization to eliminate logistics bottlenecks." He reached for my laptop, which was connected to the main display. I did not move. He yanked it toward him, his smirk widening. "A Harvard man should present the $77 million deal, not a self-taught coder," Julian whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I simply stepped back, letting him take the keyboard. Julian clicked the first slide. The presentation deck loaded smoothly. He spoke for 10 minutes, throwing out terms like leverage, synergy, and digital transformation. Harvey Peterson sat in Dallas, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the screen. "And now, for the live demonstration," Julian said, clicking the browser tab that launched the staging environment. The screen flickered. The loading icon began to spin. Julian clicked the database initialization button. A message popped up in the corner of the screen: variable path mismatch. Please reset environment variables. Julian did not read it. He kept smiling at the camera. As you can see, our system is currently initializing the real-time routing algorithm, simulating 10,000 shipments across the central corridor. He clicked again. The browser froze. The loading icon stopped spinning. Julian tapped the trackpad. Nothing happened. He tapped it harder, his smile faltering slightly. Just a temporary lag, he said, his voice rising a pitch. The server is processing a massive dataset. He clicked the button a third time. The screen went black. Then, a bold red message appeared: security handshake failed. Connection loop encrypted. Julian began to sweat. He opened the task manager and tried to force close the browser, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a panic. It was a humiliating display of technical incompetence. Harvey Peterson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Is the system supposed to crash during the initialization phase? Julian forced a laugh that sounded like a dry cough. Just a minor glitch, Harvey. We are running a fresh build. I stood in the corner, silent. I looked at Brenda Cole. She had her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. George Higgins was staring at his son, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. 10 minutes later, the call was over. Harvey Peterson had disconnected with a polite but frigid, "Thank you for your time." Julian slammed the laptop shut. He spun around, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You sabotaged me," he screamed, his face red. "You did this on purpose." "No, Julian," I said quietly. "I wrote the documentation. Page 4, paragraph 2. If you had read it, you would have known to set the environment variables. You wanted to run the demo. I let you." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his father and the silence of a dead $77 million deal. The morning after the demo disaster, the office felt like a funeral home. Nobody was talking. The only sound was the hum of the printers and the occasional nervous whisper in the hallways. At 8:15, Brenda Cole called me into her office. She did not look at me when I walked in. She was staring at her monitor, her face pale. "Joel," she said, her voice quiet, "we need to talk about the transition." "What transition?" I asked, sitting down. "George and Julian have decided to restructure the engineering team," she said, finally looking up. "Julian feels that your technical style is too rigid for the strategic direction of the company. You are being reassigned to documentation." "Reassigned?" I asked. "I built the engine, Brenda." "I know," she said, and there was genuine regret in her eyes. "But Julian is the SVP. He wants Toby to take over the Orion account. We need you to write a comprehensive, end-to-end documentation of the core routing modules. Every loop, every security handshake, every database call." "So Julian can read it?" I asked. "So the company can scale," she replied, using the corporate euphemism. "We need it completed by the end of the week." I sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in. They wanted me to write my own replacement guide. They wanted to strip me of my creation, hand the keys to a junior developer, and let the boss's son take the credit. "Understood," I said. "I will start immediately." I walked back to my desk in the basement. Toby looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. "Joel, I am so sorry," he whispered. "I did not ask for this. I do not know how to run the integration." "It is fine, Toby," I said, patting his shoulder. "You just do what they tell you." I opened a fresh document and began to write. I spent the next 4 days writing the most detailed, beautiful, and completely useless documentation in the history of software development. I documented the database schemas. I documented the front-end widgets. I documented the API endpoints. I wrote hundreds of pages of clean, professional explanation. But I did not document the core security architecture of Module 6. Module 6 was the routing engine's brain. It was the piece of code that handled the cryptographic key verification between the database and the client's network. When I built it, I realized that if the system was ever compromised, a malicious actor could hijack the entire supply chain. So, I had built a private key authentication layer around it. The cryptographic key was tied to my personal development signature. It was an air-gapped security protocol. Without my signature, the system would compile. But the moment it tried to establish a connection with an external network, Module 6 would throw an authentication conflict and shut down the database ports. It was not malicious code. It was a standard high-level security practice. If the company had had a functioning legal and compliance department, they would have known about it, but they did not. They had Julian. On Thursday afternoon, Julian held an internal review meeting to show the board that he had the integration under control. He had Toby compile a new build of the engine, using my fresh documentation. I watched from the hallway as they ran the build on the staging server. I could see the screen through the glass window of the conference room. Toby clicked the deploy button, the system initialized, and then the screen turned red. OAuth keyholder mismatch. Module 6 connection terminated. Toby began typing furiously, his face turning pale. Julian stood behind him, shouting and gesturing wildly. He pointed at the screen, then at Toby, then slammed his hand on the table and stormed out. Nobody called me. Nobody asked for help. They were too proud and too terrified to admit they had no idea how to solve the problem. Meanwhile, I spent the afternoon backing up my personal files. I saved every commit log, every email warning I had sent to Julian, and every compliance report I had filed over the last 6 years. I also pulled out my copy of the employment contract I had signed when I joined Novus Systems 12 years ago. It was a dusty paper document from the pre-merger era. I turned to the intellectual property clause. When I was hired, Novus Systems was a tiny local partnership. My contract had a specific clause stating that any utility software developed by me outside of my core hours that utilized my own proprietary algorithms remained my personal property, licensed to the company for a temporary period. The license was non-transferable and would expire upon any major corporate restructuring unless a formal assignment of rights was executed in writing. 4 years ago, Novus Systems had restructured, dissolving the partnership and forming a C corporation. The legal department had never sent me the assignment form. I smiled. I did not just own the cryptographic key. I owned the algorithm itself. Under 17 United States Code, Section 106, I held the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and display the copyrighted work. By attempting to sell my algorithm to Orion Logistics as their own proprietary asset, Novus Systems was committing copyright infringement. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. The panic began to leak through the floorboards on Friday morning. I could hear the shouting from the executive wing upstairs even before I reached the break room. At 8:15, the email started rolling in. Joel, I need you to release the cryptographic signature for Module 6 immediately. This is a blocker for the Orion integration. George Higgins, Joel, call my office. We need to resolve this technical issue now. Julian Higgins. I ignored them. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, sat at my desk, and opened my personal email. There was a message from Harvey Peterson, the Orion CTOs. Joel, we are reviewing the latest deployment packet from Novus Systems, and our security auditors are flagging a persistent authentication failure in the core routing module. Your junior developer, Toby, says the key is tied to your personal signature. Can you hop on a call to clarify? I replied, Hi, Harvey. Per our company's new strategic direction, I have been reassigned to documentation and removed from client-facing duties. I am legally restricted from discussing system integration without a signed data release form from our corporate counsel. I suggest you contact George Higgins for clarification. I knew exactly what Harvey would do. He would contact George, and he would not be polite about it. By 9 o'clock, George Higgins had called an emergency meeting. I walked into the boardroom, my tea in hand. The atmosphere was toxic. George looked 10 years older, his face haggard and his eyes bloodshot. Julian was pacing by the whiteboard, his suit jacket gone, his sleeves rolled up, looking like a man who was drowning in shallow water. Joel, George said, his voice shaking. We have a crisis. Orion is threatening to pull out of the deal if we do not resolve the Module 6 error by 5 o'clock today. What is this key? It is a cryptographic signature, George, I said, sitting down. I built it to protect the database during external integrations. Well, unlock it, Julian snapped, turning on me. It is company property. You built it while working here, actually. Julian, it is not, I said, placing my tea on the table. I pulled out a copy of my original employment contract and laid it on the mahogany wood. I pointed to the intellectual property clause. Under 17 United States Code Section 106, I own the exclusive copyrights to the core optimization algorithm. The license I granted to the original partnership expired 4 years ago during the corporate restructuring. Because you never executed a formal assignment of rights, Novus Systems does not own the intellectual property you are trying to sell to Orion Logistics. Julian laughed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. That is ridiculous. You are an employee. We own everything you write. Not according to federal patent and copyright law, I replied, and certainly not under the terms of this contract. If you attempt to package my algorithm in the Orion deal, you are committing copyright infringement and contract fraud. George Higgins turned to Brenda Cole. Is this true? Brenda looked down at her hands. Our legal team is reviewing it now, she whispered. However, the assignment files are empty. George slumped in his chair, his jaw slack. We can just rewrite the module, Julian said, his voice rising in panic. Toby can write a new script. It took me 6 years to build that engine, Julian, I said. Toby is a talented junior, but it will take him 6 months just to understand the data pipelines. You have 6 hours. Julian stared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. I stood up. I require a data release form signed by all parties before I can engage in any further technical support, I said. Until then, I am on my scheduled documentation duties. I walked out of the room. I spent the next 3 hours eating a bag of chips and watching the chaos unfold. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a junior paralegal from our legal department ran down the stairs and dropped a document on my desk. Here is the release form. Joel, she said, panting. George said to sign it and unlock the module immediately. I looked at the document. It was not a data release form. It was a retroactive intellectual property assignment form, transferring all copyrights of patent 4312 and the optimization algorithm to Novus Systems. I looked at the signature line. My name was already written there in blue ink. I stared at it. It was a clumsy, hurried forgery of my signature. They had been so desperate to show Orion's legal team that the IP chain was clean that George or Julian had forged my name on the document. I felt a cold thrill of absolute triumph. Forgery is a criminal offense under California Penal Code Section 470. By forging my signature on a federal copyright transfer, they had not only invalidated the document, but they had also committed a felony. I did not sign the document. I did not scan it. I took my personal phone, took a high-resolution photo of the forged signature next to my actual signature on my employment contract, and emailed it directly to Harvey Peterson at Orion Logistics, with our general counsel CC. The subject line was simple: document discrepancy. I hit send. 10 minutes later, the building went completely silent. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the final technical conference call was scheduled. I walked into the boardroom without being invited. I sat at the far end of the table, my arms folded. George Higgins was sitting at the center, looking like a ghost. Julian stood behind him, his face pale and his hands shaking. Brenda Cole and Toby Allen were seated in the corner, silent and still. The screen flickered, and Harvey Peterson appeared. He was not smiling. Beside him sat Orion's chief legal counsel, a woman with steel-gray hair and a cold, analytical gaze. George, Harvey began, his voice flat and heavy. We received the documentation packet your son sent over this afternoon. Great, Julian blurted out, stepping forward. You will see that the intellectual property assignment is fully executed. The cryptographic key issue was just a legacy transition delay. We are ready to deploy the module. Harvey Peterson did not look at Julian. He kept his eyes on George, Harvey said. Our legal team has reviewed the document. We also received an email from Joel Vance containing a high-resolution comparison of his signature. George Higgins did not move. He looked like a man waiting for the hammer to fall. The signature on the retroactive intellectual property transfer is a clear forgery, Harvey's legal counsel said, her voice cutting through the room like a razor. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forgery of an intellectual property assignment document is a felony. Furthermore, because the transfer is void, Novus Systems does not hold the rights to the core routing algorithm under 17 United States Code Section 106. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but Harvey Peterson cut him off with a sharp gesture. Shut up, Julian, Harvey said. You took a system you did not understand, crashed it in front of our team, demoted the man who built it, and then forged his signature to cover up your incompetence. That is not strategic vision. That is criminal behavior. Harvey looked directly at George. Orion Logistics is terminating all contract negotiations with Nova Systems effective immediately. We will not do business with a company that commits fraud. The screen went black. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Julian collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. George Higgins sat frozen, staring at the blank screen, his career and his company's reputation shattered in a single afternoon. I stood up, walked to my desk in the basement, gathered my things, and swiped my badge for the last time. I did not look back. On Saturday morning, my phone rang. It was Harvey Peterson Jull, he said, his voice warm. I assume you are no longer with Nova Systems. I am a free agent, Harvey, I replied, sitting on my balcony with a cup of tea. We still need that routing engine, Joel. We want to hire you directly as an independent consultant to integrate the system into our network. We will license the code directly from you, I smiled. I am open to that. What are the terms? We are offering a 9-month contract at $420,000 with a go-forward royalty of 2% on all transactions processed by your engine. I took a sip of tea. That sounds acceptable, Harvey. Send over the paperwork. By Monday afternoon, George Higgins had sent a courier to my house. I watched through the window as the courier stood on my porch, sweating in the afternoon heat, holding a large box of flowers in a thick leather folder. Inside the folder was a formal 3-page letter of apology, signed by George and Julian, along with a retroactive consulting offer that was 3 times my old salary, and a non-disclosure agreement. I did not open the door. I let the courier stand there for 10 minutes before he finally took a photo of the porch and walked back to his car. The flowers withered on the porch. The papers remained unsigned. I signed the Orion Logistics contract that evening. Today, I run my own independent consulting firm, Vance Systems Engineering, from a quiet office overlooking the lake. I work 30 hours a week, earn 4 times what I made at Novus, and I never have to listen to a Harvard MBA talk about synergy again. Nova Systems is currently undergoing a full compliance audit by their investors, and rumors are that George Higgins is being forced to step down. Julian's career in tech is over before it even began. They thought they could take my work, call me outdated, and slide his name onto the lease. But they forgot that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and I was the one who laid the concrete. I took a sip of my tea and smiled. The door was locked, the engine was mine, and the view from the lake was beautiful.